Hey everyone, welcome to a midweek sermon follow-up as we break down some of the ideas from this past message, but as we see them in our weekly readings, not from the sermon itself, but from the follow-up that we use to continue to stay on this and chew on this throughout the week. So if you missed the message, you can always find it at discovercommunity.org under sermons. It'll be the one right up at the top. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, our podcast, a couple different ways. But so as we dive in, we were looking, we're working through 1 Peter. We're in 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10. This idea of as we come to Jesus, the living stone, we ourselves, like living stones, are built up into what God calls the Royal Priesthood. And so we looked at this identity of Royal Priesthood, the honor of it, but then also this really vital truth that we have to grasp that in entering into that, we are entering into a covenant. And in a covenant, both sides make a commitment to one another. And so we can't just say, okay, God, I want you to uphold your part of the covenant where you forgive my sins and I get, the righteousness of Christ. I just don't want to uphold my part of it as a royal priesthood. And so we looked at this idea, a beautiful passage, one that is so encouraging to me, just so uplifting and mind-blowing to really consider. Really? But any thoughts from the sermon, or you want to dive into Exodus 19?
No, I think your sermon was pretty straightforward, very encouraging, very good, very challenging, but also encouraging. So I think we could dive right in, because I think the readings give a massive context to royal priesthood and what that means and all that stuff. So
cool. So I think maybe the most obvious thing that people will see in Exodus 19, the first chapter of this week's reading, but just in case you didn't happen to catch it, verses 5 and 6. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, right? So there's that idea that in entering into a covenant, we have a responsibility to uphold. But then he says, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so I love that, because it's like, this has been God's plan from the beginning. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't, oh shoot, I have to adjust my plan on the fly. It was like, no, from
this was always the plan. This
was the honor God wanted to bestow on his people, which is really cool. Because then you look at verse 8 where it says, where the people then say, right, so it's like God says, look, this is my part of the covenant that I will uphold. And then in verse 8, it says, all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And so I love the covenantal relationship you see in this first part of Exodus 19.
It is such a good chapter. And I think like the obvious, you shall be my treasured possession. I mean, it's the same words.
It's same words.
Like he might literally be pulling it straight from here. But also the rest of the chapter in the context of God coming down on the mountain to meet the people he's making a covenant with is kind of mind-blowing. Every time I read it, I'm like, this is outrageous.
Well, and it's so cool, because what you just said is, God coming down to meet his people and make a covenant with them, right? This idea of God coming down to dwell among his people in the tabernacle, so that and then it goes on and talks about, right, like consecration of the priests. And as we move forward throughout Exodus, then you're going to see the physical construction and rules of the tabernacle laid out, which Hebrews 9 will allude to. But that idea that you just said about God coming down to meet his people and establish the covenant, I mean, you talk about a parallel to Jesus, right? God coming down to dwell among his people, to tabernacle among them, and establish the new covenant. And so I love the parallels.
It's a huge parallel.
Just now thinking of that as you point that out, which is a great detail.
No, because I think that's the, him literally saying, you will be my treasured possession among all the peoples. I mean, not all the peoples are having this experience right now. This is God showing them, listen, I'm not doing this for everybody. I want you guys to be the treasured possession, of course, so that other nations will be blessed.
Abraham, which we'll get to
Genesis 12.
And
then all the other, and that's what I love about the readings, because they feed into, it's like building blocks. So like when you read this, and then when you read the next one that we're going to talk about, it just like, there's a beautiful contrast, and
And I think the idea that really transitions from Exodus 19 into 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, where we can go. But in verse 22, it says, let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves. And so this idea, this reminder of, okay, we are the priests now that he's talking about in 1 Peter. And so there needs to be that consecration, empowered by the Lord, done by the Lord, for the Lord, which is really cool. And then you come to 2 Corinthians, and you've got 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. And we're talking about, ministers of the new covenant. And this is a right of the believers. And one of the main points of the sermon, really the large driving point of the sermon, was that this royal priesthood is an honor, not a burden. It's a joy, it's a privilege, it's exciting. And so I love in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 8, or 7, it says, if the ministry of death carved in letters on stone came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory. So it's this big impressive thing where I go, whoa, this ministry, like you couldn't even look at Moses. And he's like, which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? And it's just this beautiful reminder of like, man, this ministry that we have been given as ministers of the new covenant is a ministry of glory and honor. And so I love that 2 Corinthians 3 kind of starts off with that idea.
Yeah, I mean, huge, just in that same vein, because that's what he's talking about. He's comparing, like, okay, if this covenant, the old covenant, came with such glory, where God descended on a mountain like smoke, they couldn't even touch the mountain or they would die because God's glory was fully there. How much more now that he lives inside of you? I was like, what?
Crazy.
Because then it says, what does it say? Because he's like the verse 7 you just talked about. He's like, they couldn't gaze at his face, like Moses had to wear a veil so that the glory wouldn't blind them,
wouldn't overwhelm them.
And then you go down and says, where is it at? 18. But we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of God and being transformed to his same image from one degree to the other, or from glory to glory. Just like that idea of like, we don't have a veil on.
We can behold the glory as we are being transformed into it, right? As we come to the living stone, we ourselves like living stones. That just the continued parallel of ideas. And then I love verse 12 talking about that, and it says, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Since I am unveiled, since I have the glory indwelling in me, I am bold as a minister of this new covenant. Which again goes to, if you're throwing a life raft to a drowning person, you're not ashamed of that fact. It's a joy to get to do that. Then you come into verse 5 or chapter 4, and it flows right into it. And you have so many, one of the things we talked about is what will save people, not dismantling their arguments, but the gospel. So
that was huge.
As priests, we need to give people the gospel. For verse 5, for what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord. We need to give people the unvarnished, undistorted gospel. This is it. I don't need to add to it. I don't need to take from it. I don't need to apologize for it. This is it. Jesus is Lord. Let me unpack that for you. And then I also love verse 7. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. That's another thing we talked about in the sermon, right? Like, this is not an arrogant honor. It's not, I have this honor because I'm better than you. It's like, no, man, I'm a jar of clay. Right? And so I think that's really just a really cool reminder here in verse 4. I've got some other verses, in chapter 4 rather, not verse 4, chapter 4. I've got some other verses. I don't want to take all the thunder of chapter 4.
Dude, you can take all the thunder if you want. I mean, really, my only thing that because on your point of like, with non-believers, because that's the trap I fall into. Okay, let me dismantle all the arguments and all the holes into why people don't believe in Christianity. But in verse 4 of chapter 4, it says, in their case, the unbelievers, the God of this world has blinded their minds to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. So just as the Jewish people have a veil when they read the Old Testament and they can't see past the old covenant into the new, unbelievers can't see past the blindedness of their mind. And what is it that kind of frees them from that? Paul says it's repentance.
Yep.
When you turn to Jesus, or when anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted.
Yep.
So like you're saying, it's not an argument. An argument will never, ever convince someone of the gospel, that God is real. Only the gospel will.
Yeah. And so then our prayer needs to be not let them see I'm right, but Lord, unblind their heart, unblind their eyes.
Yep. That was my main thing.
Yeah. I love it. Some of the other verses I love, chapter 4, verse 13. So he's saying that since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke. We also believe and so we also speak. And it's just that idea that a priest has a responsibility.
Sorry.
I get so fired up. I need to like swallow. A priest has a responsibility.
Yeah.
And that is to speak. And that is to speak the gospel. You go back to Malachi 2, right? People should listen to a priest because he should be a messenger from God. And so verse 13, right? Like, we believe and so we speak. Like, I love the logic statement of that. You know, if A, then B.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if I tip your cup over, then the liquid will pour out.
Yeah.
If I believe, I speak. Like, it's just so concise.
It's like the natural flow of my belief. Like, this is what should happen organically.
Because of verse 15, right?
Yeah.
For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. And that goes to what we talked about Sunday's message. We should want to share this honor. Like, how selfish is it of us to partake in this honor and not want to share it?
Yeah.
And not just, well, no, I want to share it. Okay, well, what are you doing to share it with people? And so I love verse 15, right? That idea of as grace extends to more and more people. Like, our desire should be that the people we can't stand, right? I mean, let's be honest. There are people who are like, man, I can't stand that guy and his brokenness, right? You think of the most antagonistic comedian, talk show host, politician, like you think of the famous people who just mock Christianity, and our desire should be like, Lord, please extend your grace to that person so that I can be thankful for that. Because that will be to your glory. And so I love chapter 4.
Yeah, man, there's so much. I mean, you can go on the end of chapter 4, but I just love the encouragement at the very end where he says, so because of that, we do not lose heart.
So we do not lose heart.
Because of all of the glory and the surpassing glory and the unveiled face and all the covenant and all of God's grace, we don't lose heart.
And I mean, you can, you saying that triggered so many thoughts, right? Like, you can even tie that to what's the theme of 1st and 2nd Peter? Victory in trials.
I'm literally,
right? And so, I mean, you've got even, like, let's back up to middle of verse 4, or of chapter 4. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Like, victory in trials. And so it's just, it all flows. It all ties together. It's beautiful.
It all flows very nicely. Yeah. I mean, we can literally keep going on.
You just go verse by verse through 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. But then you have Hebrews 9 and 11. And Hebrews 9 is really cool because it so strongly ties back into what we alluded to back in Exodus, the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies and the process and the proper procedure of priestly duties. And so in the first, chapter 9, verses 1 through really 7, you've got the establishment of Old Testament priesthood. And then in chapters 9, verses 8 on, now you kind of have like the New Testament priesthood and just those cool parallels, which I think is just a really, I think chapter 9, the reason I picked it, the reason I thought it fit with the message is because it just continues to provide that contextual Old Testament priesthood to New Testament priesthood, perfection of Jesus, and what that means for us as that new royal priesthood that God refers to.
Yeah, it gives a lot of context to what is the priesthood, what it was meant to do, why did God establish it. And it just gives a lot of context of when Peter's saying that, what he means. This is what I mean when I say you're a royal priesthood. But I thought a great connection that went well with what you chose in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, where it talked about the veiled and unveiled face, not being able to see the light of the gospel, or even just the contrast between the glory of the old covenant to the surpassing glory of the new covenant, was like verse 9, where he says, according to this arrangement, talking about the whole arrangement of the priesthood and all of their duties, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. So they are there to keep the communion with God, but they were never meant in the old covenant to cleanse the conscience of the worshiper. But then he goes on and says in verse 14, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And so that's just the cool contrast of what the old covenant couldn't do and was not meant to do. Jesus fulfilled it and did it. And so I just thought that was a nice contrast to it.
I love it. And then in that same verse 14, right, it purifies our conscience. Why? To serve the living God. Priests are called to serve. Old Testament, priests are called to serve. New Testament.
If and then.
Just very, very cool. Love that. Then you've got Hebrews 11, Hall of Faith chapter, Hall of Fame chapter. I think the verses I love there are 16 and 25 and 26. And in verse 16, talking about, you know, these all died in faith, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. It says, as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. And then you jump down to verse 25 and 26, speaking about Moses. And it says, you know, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking to the reward. And that, I mean, Hebrews 12:1, right? Like, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every sin that entangles. Doing what? Looking forward to Jesus. And so in this Hall of Fame faith chapter, you've got desire, like, you've got people who recognize that we are exiles. Which goes back to the very first sermon we did in the series on 1 Peter, where Peter calls them exiles, which they literally were. But then the parallel lesson is that we are spiritual exiles. And so I love this reminder in Hebrews 11 of that our perspective should not be on this life and this earth. We should live for God's glory in this life and, you know, this earth, like all of that. But our ultimate eyes, like ultimately our eyes need to be set on our heavenly home. And Jesus, looking forward.
Oh, that's such a good connection. And encouragement, because it just reminds me of what Paul says in Colossians, like, look to the things not below but above. Like, keep your mind set on the heavenly things,
not on the earth.
And that's what keeps you in the same mindset as all of these who didn't see the fulfillment of Jesus that was prophesied in their day, but didn't see the fulfillment of it, but they stayed faithful to it, knowing that it would come. But I love, one thing that I loved reading through this, and I just love reading through it, you know, when it comes up or as often as possible. But I love that the people you wouldn't expect to be in this list are in this list. And one person I didn't, for some reason I just haven't noticed, is Samson. And Jordan and I were just talking about this, about how, like, how could Samson, you know, when you read the story of Samson in Judges, and he gives up what the Lord has given him. He's given up the power. He goes off and he does his own thing. He's basically the prodigal son. You know what I mean? Like, he literally defiles himself in ways that God tells him not to. Yet, you know, you read the whole story or whatever, he's redeemed, but he makes it on this list, like, despite his failings and all of his wanderings. And so I just think it's a great encouragement of, like, God doesn't choose his priests based on their merits. He chooses them based on Jesus, and our belief in him.
Boom. That's the great final thought.
The great final thought.
Done. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. As always, we'd love to hear from you, how God used these chapters to continue to teach you this week. Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you Sunday.
See you then.
Hey everyone, Pastor Sam here. Thanks for joining us for another midweek Bible study video. If you didn't see the sermon that we were talking about, you can find it here. Or if you're interested in more of these midweek Bible study videos and thoughts as Pastor Mario and I break things down, you can find that here as well. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel.